Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Natalia Moczulska, and this is the news. Due to the presence of the Wagner Group in Belarus, a decision has been made to increase the forces permanently present on the border, as well as to develop additional fortifications in Poland. The Polish Deputy Prime Minister added that the presence of the Wagner Group in Belarus could mean a new phase of hybrid warfare. After a failed putsch in Russia, Wagner Group head Yevgeny Prigozhin and his men are on Belarusian territory. Reinforcement refers to both an increase in the forces that will be there permanently and an increase in the number of different types of obstacles and fortifications to protect our border should it come under attack. Exact information about the number of troops and equipment for reasons of Polish security is kept secret. Security of the state border is primarily the responsibility of the border guards, but the Polish military is also involved. Let me remind you that the temporary fence was made by the engineering troops. Now we have a permanent fence, but it is also reinforced by military patrols. Experts indicate that Wagner's group does not pose a direct military threat to Poland, but the mercenaries could be used to smuggle illegal migrants. We can take into account such a threat that these bandits will be used by Russian or Belarusian services, although it is one and the same, for some provocations on the border, and there must be reinforcement, support of border services by the military, and there must be an increase in combat readiness. Wagner's group is a private army used by the Kremlin. Unofficially, up to 12,000 mercenaries may be stationed in Belarus. A week ago, there was also information about the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons on the territory of the Belarusian state. This is a challenge for the Belarusian society, because murderers, war criminals, rapists are coming, but also this entity can continue to develop. No one knows what Lukashenko and Prigozhin agreed on. In recent weeks, there has been an increase in illegal traffic on the Polish-Belarusian border. There have been physical attacks on guards. In June alone, 13 official vehicles were damaged. The border barrage is helping to repel the hybrid attack on Poland. The task of the physical barrier is to stop illegal border crossings. This barrier fulfills these tasks 100%. Individuals overcome this barrier, of course, but only and only if the Belarusian services help them. Without the support of the Belarusian services, they would certainly not be able to overcome these safeguards. Opposition politicians have criticized the government since the beginning of the attack on the Polish border. Border guard officers have been compared to trash and German war criminals. MEP elected from the European coalition lists, Janina Ochojska, says outright that the barrier must be abolished. And do you think that after the elections, if the opposition wins, this barrier should be taken down? I think so. There are 1,800 kilometers of barriers in Europe. Those barriers will have to be torn down again. Many opposition politicians do not distinguish between the government and the Polish state. A Polish politician can criticize the government, while one should defend the interests of the state at all costs. Unfortunately, civic platform politicians are unable to see this and very often attack the Polish nation, especially abroad, violating the basic interests of our nation. Meanwhile, the first Abrams tanks purchased by the Law and Justice government arrived in Poland yesterday. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department has agreed to sell Poland 48 launchers of the Patriot system and more than 600 missiles for these launchers. Also, we know here about big plans when it comes to tanks from South Korea. So K2 Black Panther tanks. At the moment, we have probably 30 of them. And the contract that has already been concluded says that 180 will be delivered. Russia and Belarus launched a hybrid war against Poland and the Baltic states in the summer of 2021. Moscow, in cooperation with Minsk, wanted to flood these countries with a wave of illegal migrants to prevent them from accepting war refugees from Ukraine. However, thanks in part to the border guard and the barrier built, this practice has been limited. Earlier today, Ukraine conducted nuclear disaster response drills in the vicinity of the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, regional officials said. Kiev accused Russia this month of planning a terrorist attack at the southern plant involving the release of radiation. Moscow denied the accusation. Yuri Malashko, governor of the Zaporizhzhia region that includes the plant, said the drills in Zaporizhzhia city and the district around it were intended to coordinate the response of all services to an emergency situation at the plant. We have organized everything in a way that people would understand as much as possible what is going on. This is not the first drill and not the last one. As long as the enemy is at the Zaporizhzhia station, we have to be prepared. Officials and civil defense forces worked on scenarios that might follow a nuclear disaster and on how to inform and evacuate the population. We have assumed the worst scenario in which the contamination zone will be bigger than 50 kilometers. This would mean 4 regions would be affected. The results of our drill are good. As you can see, our institutions are ready for the challenges posed by the Russian Federation, in particular for the damage they may cause to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There are various scenarios, but we are getting ready for the worst. Rescuers in yellow and white protective gear and gas masks used dosimeters to check passenger cars and trucks for radiation levels, and then cleaned wheels before vehicles underwent additional decontamination at specialized washing points. A man on a stretcher was brought into a medical tent as sirens blared. Of course it is scary. I fear for my family, my child. What do we do? Very scary. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, has been occupied by Russia since early March last year, shortly after Moscow's full-scale invasion, and Kiev and Moscow have accused each other of shelling the vast complex. Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, suffered the world's worst nuclear accident in 1986 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Poland will demand the reform of the European Union's border agency Frontex and more funds for dealing with migrants, Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said earlier today, as he prepared to oppose a migration deal at an EU summit in Brussels. Here today at the European Council meeting, I will propose a plan called the Europe of Secure Borders. The Europe of Secure Borders is no to illegal immigration. It is a no for imposed financial penalties. It is no to the resignation of unanimity rule. And it is yes to sovereignty, yes to security, yes to the security of Polish borders, Polish streets, Polish cities and towns. But we also wish this to all of our European friends. We have an alternative plan. A plan of securing Europe's borders, and I will present it here, and it will be about reinforcing Frontex, who is also signaling that illegal immigration indirectly supports smuggling groups. It supports de facto terrorism in Europe. It is enough to look at what Frontex writes in their reports. Under the deal reached earlier this month, each country would be responsible for a set number of migrants, but would not necessarily have to take them in. Countries unwilling to receive irregular migrants and refugees arriving ad hoc to the EU would help their hosting peers through cash, around 20,000 euros per person, equipment or personnel. Poland says it will hold a referendum on whether to accept the deal, possibly on the same day as elections scheduled for October or November. European Union leaders gathered today to discuss the aborted mutiny in Russia and debate what role the EU could play in long-term Western commitments to bolster Ukraine's security. Arriving for a summit in Brussels, leaders said they remained committed to supporting Ukraine in the war triggered by Russia's invasion of its neighbor in February last year. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg joined the leaders for a working lunch, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was also expected to address the summit by video link. We are not party to what is happening in Russia. This is a problem that Russian President Vladimir Putin has brought on himself. We can only observe it, and our goal here is not a change of government, a regime change in Russia. Our goal, which we are pursuing, is an independent Ukraine.
It's clear that Putin goes out of this crisis weakened, but a weaker Putin is a greater danger. So we have to be very much aware of the consequences. Everything remains unclear what has happened, who were behind this attempt of military upheaval or military rebellion. And some generals has been arrested, so I suppose that Putin will be in a cleaning mood internally and a more assertive mood.
The mutiny we saw at the weekend demonstrates that there are cracks and divisions within the Russian system. At the same time, it is important to underline that these are internal Russian matters. And it's too early to draw any final conclusions, also because it's not yet clear how many of the Wagner forces that will end up in Belarus or other places. What matters for NATO is that we will continue to support Ukraine.
The two-day summit is a regular gathering of the EU's 27 national leaders, with a range of topics including migration, economic security, and relations with China all on the agenda. But the dominant topic is the war in Ukraine, with leaders also discussing how last weekend's aborted mutiny by the Wagner mercenary group could affect Russia.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned for Poland Daily Weather, Poland Daily Business, and some of our other programs. But for me, it's have a wonderful evening.